First, let me say that I respect Kurt as a man and a lawyer. I suggest you check out the full video at the link above. Now, before we get to Uncivil Law's take on the Nick situation, let me say this about the testing done on the 9-year-old child. A hair strand drug test screens for illicit drug use and the misuse of prescription medication. Though commonly called a hair follicle test, this drug test only tests clipped strands of hair, not the follicle located under the scalp. During this test, a small amount of hair is removed from your head using scissors. The sample is then analyzed for signs of drug use during the 90 days preceding the test. It's typically used to test for methamphetamine, ecstasy, marijuana, cocaine, PCP, and opioids. While a urine drug screen can detect if you've used drugs in the last few days, a hair drug test can detect drug use in the past 90 days. Now let the sweeping begin.
Do not indicate whether a confirmation test was done and whether this is just a preliminary number. And again, based on my very limited Google foo, trying to figure out exactly what this means to this morning, there apparently are different procedures that are used after a preliminary test for the confirmatory test. So as best as I could determine, it could be the case that in a preliminary test, it's just the hair as is. But in a confirmation test, for example, the hair might be washed first, which, depending on the various scholars I attempted to read, may or may not be necessarily particularly effective, incidentally, at getting rid of cocaine that is merely on the hair as opposed to in it. But I digress. It's also not clear what procedures were used exactly. So I'm not being given information, so I just have to highlight these things. I don't know because the government's not telling me. All they're telling me is it was 5,000 presumptively picograms per milliliter or picograms per milligram with a cutoff of 500 picograms per milligram. And they don't even really tell me that much. They don't even show their units. And they don't tell me if this is confirmed. So I'm a little bit frustrated by that. I'm a little bit annoyed. But the fact that it's only one child instead of all the children is more suggestive, at least to me, right? If I'm trying to think about what this means, right, it is more suggestive, at least to me, that one of the children came into accidental cross-contamination exposure that is not a frequent occurrence at the house. Because, well, if it were more frequent or more common, then presumptively more than one of the 5 kids would have it, right? I mean, that would be logical. So if only one of the 5 kids has it, then it presumably indicates that this is a accidental cross-contamination exposure that I assume, based on the fact that it's 1 out of 5, is only essentially a one-off, as opposed to being a more habitual thing, because again, if it were more habitual, you would expect it to hit more of the children, which it didn't. So it's more suggestive of a single exposure. At least that is the logic that I have applied to this. But I readily admit that I'm out of my depth on the practical implications of this. I am not a doctor. I don't have any particular education in drugs. I don't have any particular knowledge of this. I just did my best to try to read some academic articles to try to get a sense of what this was talking about so that I have some vague clue about what I'm talking about to try to reach some sort of conclusions that hopefully made some sort of sense. If I'm not using enough qualifications in this, you're not understanding what I'm trying to tell you. But that's what I got. All right. But either way, regardless of what it means practically, regardless of what it means medically, regardless of how much I should be concerned on that frame, regardless of all that, it's over 5,000. So it's 10 times the threshold, which is not exactly great. It's not exactly great. So, if it were like if it were closer to 500, then we'd be more in a position to play around with the margins. This is exactly what we did earlier when we were talking about the amount of cocaine that was found, right? We said, oh, it's 26 grams and change when we talked about the total amount of cocaine. But by the government's own documents, that included the packaging, right? So maybe we can dick around on the margins because we're kind of near the threshold. So maybe we can make this 26 grams more like 24 grams. And if we can make the 26 grams more like 24 grams, then hey, that's pretty good, because that would, by operation of the law, reduce this from a second degree charge to a third degree charge, which is obviously preferable. But that we can only do that because we were playing on the margins, right? We're only doing that because we can play on the margins. But here, not so much with playing on the margins. You know, this isn't 550, this is 5,000. So the sort of playing around on the margins idea doesn't exactly readily lend itself to these sets of facts, it seems to me. So I don't think that works. So short of somehow, you know, some way, you know, that the hair was unduly exposed to cocaine on that particular day, which I don't know even what that would be. He was putting powder in his hair for some reason, and it was cocaine powder. So, or, you know, the child was putting cocaine powder in their hair by accident. So short of that, you know, I don't know what scenario this would be that it wouldn't be concerning, because, well, you know, it's 10 times the legal threshold, which seems to be a common threshold used by the government, as best as I can tell, for at least some purposes, and a common threshold that's used by employers for some purposes. So it's not, and I incidentally couldn't find any threshold more than 500. I found thresholds less than 500 for particular applications, for particular jobs in the government, for example. So I found cutoffs with less than 500, but I couldn't find, at least in my limited research, any cutoff of more than 500.